carrying with it the creak of old wagon wheels and the faint cry of children waiting for their mothers to finish bartering for flour or beans. And in the middle of it all stood Sarah, a woman no older than 25, whose hands were cracked from work and whose eyes held the exhaustion of a life that had given more hardship than comfort. She clutched a small coin purse in her hand, the last of her savings, and stepped into the general store with a faint hope that maybe today she could bring home enough to cook a decent meal for her 2 younger brothers and her ailing father, who lay coughing in the corner of their one-room shack. But the shopkeeper, a stout man with little patience, shook his head before she had even finished placing her coins on the counter, muttering something about accounts unsettled, debts unpaid, and customers who didn't bring profit not being worth his time. And Sarah, her face flushed with humiliation, gathered the few coins back into her trembling palm and turned away, the ache in her stomach matching the ache in her heart as she stepped out onto the wooden porch, where the setting sun painted the world in amber tones and shadows stretched long across the road. And it was there, as she lowered her gaze to hide the shame in her eyes, that she heard the slow, steady jingle of spurs and the soft snort of a horse, lifting her head just in time to see him. The cowboy who seemed carved from the very land itself, tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered hat pulled low over piercing eyes, his long coat moving with the breeze like a cloak of dust and earth, a man whose silence spoke louder than most people's shouting. And in that moment he stopped, his gaze lingering on her as though he had seen the whole scene unfold from across the street, and she felt as though those eyes of his could see straight through to the hunger she tried to hide, the loneliness she tried to bury, the quiet desperation of someone who had learned to survive but never to truly live. And for a heartbeat she wanted to run, because kindness from strangers often carried a price. But before she could move, before she could pretend she was fine and walk away, he spoke, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that had told 1,000 stories on the trail, and yet it carried with it something gentle, something unshakable, as he said, "Come with me. I'll fill your table tonight." And those words, simple as they were, hit her harder than a sermon on Sunday, because no one had offered her that kind of promise in years. And she stood frozen, the basket in her hands empty, her heart pounding as though unsure whether to trust or to retreat. But there was something in his manner that told her he wasn't playing a game, wasn't mocking her poverty, and so she nodded ever so slightly, allowing herself to hope just for a moment. And he tipped his hat in acknowledgement before leading his horse toward the hitching post, gesturing for her to follow. And she did, her steps hesitant but steady, until she found herself standing beside him in the fading light, the scent of leather and dust clinging to him, the strength of his presence filling the empty spaces inside her. And together they walked down the street toward where the wide prairie stretched into forever, his words replaying in her mind, each one a small spark against the darkness that had so long consumed her spirit. And she wondered who this man was, what past he carried in the lines of his face and the calluses of his hands, and why, out of all the people in town, he had chosen to notice her when others turned away. But she didn't ask, not yet, because some answers only come when the time is right. And for now it was enough to walk beside him, enough to feel that maybe, just maybe, life could change if she dared to believe. And as the town faded behind them and the stars began to rise over the plains, she felt the stirring of a story much larger than hunger or hardship, a story of kindness, of trust, and perhaps of love. And though she didn't know what tomorrow held, she knew this night would not end in silence around an empty table. And as her stomach growled softly, almost embarrassed to be heard, he gave her a half smile, the kind that carried more comfort than a full feast. And in that moment she believed him, truly believed that he would keep his word, that tonight her table would not only be filled with food but with something far rarer, hope. And with that thought warming her chest, she followed him into the gathering night, unaware that this simple act of trust was the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. And to everyone watching, to everyone listening, let this story remind you that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the greatest shifts in destiny. So stay with us, keep following this tale, and don't forget to subscribe, because the journey has only just begun. The prairie night stretched wide and endless, a velvet blanket scattered with silver stars, the kind of sky that made a person feel both small and infinite at the same time. And as Sarah walked beside the cowboy, the crunch of gravel under her worn shoes, She wondered what kind of life he had lived to move with such quiet certainty, his boots landing steady with each step, his horse's reins held loose in his hand like he'd been born in rhythm with the animal. And after a long silence, he finally spoke, not about himself, but about her, asking in a voice low and gentle, "How long's it been since your family had a full meal?" And though her pride wanted her to lie, to brush the question off with a shrug, she couldn't summon the strength to cover truth with falsehood, so she whispered, "Too long," and he nodded without judgment, just a simple acknowledgement, like a man who knew the weight of hunger himself. And when they reached the edge of town, where lantern light faded into the